Jimi Hendrix was planning to quit music forever when Miles Davis knocked on his door at midnight. He was exhausted, depressed, and convinced that rock stardom was destroying his soul. 4 hours later, after the most incredible jam session of his life, Jimi remembered why he started playing guitar and decided to keep living. It was March 15, 1968, and Jimi Hendrix was at the lowest point of his career. The success that everyone envied was suffocating him. The constant touring, the pressure to recreate Monterey pop every night, the drugs, the hangers-on, the business vultures, it had all become too much. That night, sitting alone in his small apartment in Greenwich Village, Jimi had made a decision that would have changed music history. He was going to quit. He'd already written the letter to his manager. He'd packed his guitars. He was planning to disappear. Maybe go back to Seattle, maybe just drive until he found somewhere quiet where nobody expected him to set anything on fire or play with his teeth. The magic that had once felt limitless now felt like a prison, and Jimi couldn't see any way out except to walk away from it all. That's when Miles Davis knocked on his door. Miles wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be at home with his wife Betty, or in the studio working on his next album, or anywhere except the doorstep of a rock musician he'd been avoiding for months. But something had pulled him to Jimmy's apartment that night. Maybe intuition, maybe fate, maybe just the restlessness that had been eating at him since he'd started experimenting with electric instruments. When Jimi opened the door, Miles could immediately see that something was wrong. The usually energetic guitarist looked exhausted, defeated in a way that Miles recognized from his own dark periods. They'd barely spoken since the complicated triangle with Betty had made their friendship awkward, but in that moment, all of that seemed irrelevant. "You look like hell," Miles said, which was about as close to sympathy as Miles Davis ever got. "Feel like it too," Jimi replied. "What are you doing here, man?" "I don't know," admitted Miles. "I was walking and I ended up here. Can I come in?" Jimmy's apartment was sparse, almost monastic. A few guitars, some recording equipment, stacks of records, and not much else. It was the home of someone who lived for music and nothing else, or someone who had given up on everything except music and was about to give up on that too. Miles noticed the packed suitcases immediately. "Going somewhere?" "Maybe, probably. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Miles." "Do what?"
Any of it. The performing, the expectations, the whole rock star thing. I feel like I'm disappearing into it, you know? Like Jimi Hendrix is this character I play, and I don't remember who I was before I started playing him. Miles understood that feeling better than Jimi could have known. The pressure to be Miles Davis had been crushing him for years. The expectation to always be cool, always be innovative, always be the leader who set the direction for everyone else to follow. It was exhausting being a legend. "So what's the plan?" Miles asked, settling into a chair without being invited. "No plan, just leave. Maybe go back to Seattle, maybe keep driving until I find somewhere nobody's ever heard Purple Haze. Start over, or just stop." "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard," Miles said, but not unkindly. "You're going to quit because you're too good at what you do?" "I'm not too good at anything," Jimi said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I'm a gimmick, man. I play loud, I look wild, I set things on fire. But that's not music, that's just circus performing. And I'm tired of being the freak show." Miles looked around the apartment, his eyes settling on the guitars scattered around the room. "Play something for me." "What?" "Play something. Not for an audience, not for a record, not for anybody but me. Just play." Jimi shook his head. "I don't feel like playing." "When was the last time you played just because you wanted to, not because you had to?" Jimi thought about that for a long moment. "I don't remember." "That's your problem right there. You've forgotten why you started." There was something in Miles's voice, not judgment, but understanding, that made Jimi reach for his acoustic guitar. It was the guitar he practiced on, the one nobody ever saw him play in public. He sat down across from Miles and started playing, Nothing fancy, just soft finger-picking that filled the quiet apartment. The music that came out wasn't the Jimi Hendrix that audiences expected. It was gentle, introspective, almost classical in its approach. It was the sound of someone who learned guitar because he loved music, not because he wanted to be famous. Miles listened in silence for several minutes, hearing things in Jimmy's playing that the screaming crowds never got to experience. The sophistication, the emotional depth, the pure musical intelligence that got lost in the spectacle of rock performance. "That's beautiful," Miles said when Jimmy finished. "That's why you can't quit." "Nobody wants to hear that," Jimmy replied. "They want explosions and feedback and guitar solos that sound like machine guns. I want to hear it, and there are other people who would want to hear it too if you gave them the chance." "Like who?"
Instead of answering, Miles picked up his trumpet, which he'd been carrying in a case. "Like me. Let's play together." "Miles, I can't. Not for anybody else, just for us. Just to remember what music feels like when it's not a job." What happened next was something neither man had experienced before, despite all their musical accomplishments. When Miles began playing trumpet over Jimmy's acoustic guitar, something clicked that transcended everything they'd both been struggling with. Miles's trumpet was melodic but not dominating, weaving around Jimmy's guitar work like a conversation between old friends. Jimmy responded by playing more confidently, finding spaces in Miles's phrases where his guitar could add color and texture. They weren't trying to impress each other or prove anything. They were just making music for the pure joy of making music. The first song lasted 23 minutes, flowing from theme to theme without ever stopping. Jazz harmonies blended with rock energy, but so naturally that the genres seemed artificial. It was just two musicians speaking the same language fluently for the first time. When that piece ended, they moved immediately into another, then another. Hours passed without either man realizing it. They played ballads that made them both cry, upbeat pieces that made them laugh, and experimental passages that pushed them into musical territory neither had explored before. Around 3 a.m., they took a break, both of them exhausted but exhilarated in a way that neither had felt in months. "When was the last time you played like that?" Jimmy asked. "Never," Miles admitted. "I've never played music that felt that free, that honest." "Me neither," Jimmy said. "I forgot that music could feel like that." They talked for an hour about music, about pressure, about the difference between being a musician and being a performer. Miles shared his own struggles with the expectations that came with his reputation, while Jimmy talked about the loneliness of being famous for something that felt increasingly distant from who he really was. "The thing is," Miles said, "you can't let the business part kill the music part. The moment you do that, you're not a musician anymore. You're just a product." "But how do you keep them separate when everybody wants a piece of you all the time?" "You protect the music," Miles said. "You do whatever you have to do to protect the part of you that creates. Everything else is just noise." As the night wore on, they played more music, but also talked about collaboration, about the possibility of working together on Jimmy's terms instead of the industry's terms. They talked about acoustic sessions, about small venue performances, about music that prioritized artistry over spectacle. What if you didn't quit, but instead changed the game? What if instead of playing what people expect, you played what you want to play? They'd hate it.
Some would, but some wouldn't. And the ones who got it would really get it. By 4 a.m., something fundamental had shifted in Jimmy's perspective. The music they'd made together had reminded him why he'd fallen in love with guitar in the first place. It wasn't about being famous or being a rock star. It was about the communication that happened when musicians connected with each other and with their instruments. "I wrote a resignation letter tonight," Jimmy admitted. "I was going to send it tomorrow." "Are you still going to send it?" Jimmy was quiet for a long moment, then got up and walked to his desk. He picked up the letter he'd written and, without reading it, tore it into pieces. "No," he said, I'm going to figure out how to be a musician again instead of just a performer." Miles smiled, which was rare enough to be noteworthy. "Good, because the world needs what you do when you're not trying to be Jimi Hendrix." "What do you mean?" "I mean the music we just made. That was you being you, not you being a character. That's what people really need to hear." They played until dawn, creating music that was unlike anything either had recorded before. It was intimate, sophisticated, emotionally honest, and completely free from the expectations that had been crushing both of them. When the sun came up, Miles packed his trumpet and prepared to leave. "Are we going to do this again?" Jimi asked. "Whenever you need to remember who you are underneath all the bullshit," Miles replied. "But more importantly, you're going to keep doing it whether I'm here or not. You're going to protect the music." "How do I do that?" "By never forgetting tonight. By never forgetting that the music comes first and everything else is just business. By remembering that you're a musician who happens to be famous, not a famous person who happens to play music." After Miles left, Jimi sat in his apartment as the morning light filled the room. The suitcases were still packed, the resignation letter was still in pieces on the floor, but everything felt different. The music they'd created together was still echoing in his mind, reminding him of why he'd started playing guitar in the first place. That day, instead of disappearing, Jimi called his manager and made some changes. He canceled several upcoming performances that were just spectacle without substance. He booked studio time to record some of the quieter, more introspective music he'd been afraid to share. He started planning concerts that would showcase his musical range instead of just his ability to create chaos. The session with Miles had saved more than just Jimi's career. It had saved his relationship with music itself. It reminded him that beneath all the expectations and pressures and business considerations, there was still the pure joy of creating something beautiful with other people.
Over the following months, Jimi began incorporating elements from that night into his public performances. He started including acoustic segments in his concerts, playing more melodic and sophisticated material alongside the rock anthems that made him famous. He collaborated with jazz musicians, explored different styles, and began building a body of work that showed his full range as a musician. Miles, meanwhile, was inspired by their session to continue his own exploration of electric music, but with a greater emphasis on melody and emotional connection. The music they'd made together influenced his approach to collaboration for the rest of his career. Neither man ever recorded the music they made that night, and they rarely talked about it publicly. But musicians who knew both of them said that something had changed in their playing after March 1968, a greater willingness to be vulnerable, to prioritize emotion over technique, to remember that music was about communication between human beings. The session became legendary among the small circle of people who knew about it. Other musicians would reference the night Miles saved Jimi when talking about the healing power of collaboration and the importance of remembering why we make music in the first place. Years later, after Jimi's death, Miles would tell interviewers that the most meaningful music he ever made wasn't on any of his albums. It was in a small apartment in Greenwich Village with a rock guitarist who had forgotten how to love his own instrument until they played together. "Music is supposed to heal," Miles said in a 1975 interview. "Not just the people who hear it, but the people who make it. That night with Jimi reminded me that before music becomes a career or a business or a way to make money, it has to be a conversation between souls. And sometimes the most important conversations happen at 4 a.m. when nobody else is listening." The story of that night became a reminder to musicians struggling with the pressures of success that the music itself could save them if they remembered to protect it.
It proved that collaboration could be about mutual support and artistic growth instead of competition and ego. Today, when young musicians talk about feeling lost in the business side of music, older musicians sometimes tell them about the night Miles Davis knocked on Jimi Hendrix's door and reminded him why he started playing guitar. It's a story about the healing power of music, about the importance of artistic friendships, and about the moments when we remember who we are underneath all the expectations. The music Miles and Jimi made that night was never recorded, never performed publicly, and exists now only in the memories of two men who are both gone. But its influence can be heard in every musician who has ever used their art to save themselves or someone else, in every collaboration that prioritizes healing over competition, and in every moment when music remembers its power to transform lives. If this story of music as healing and collaboration as salvation inspired you, share it with a musician who needs to remember why they started playing. Have you ever had a musical experience that saved you when you were ready to give up? Tell us about it in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about the moments when music transcends everything else and reminds us why we need art in our lives.